Kalyn, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks, Aldo. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, I stumbled across the interview that you did on WSCR, and I learned about this podcast that you're doing, and I remember reading about the story years ago, particularly after the incident in the church, and we'll get into all these specifics, and so I was fascinated by it. I listened to episode 1 this morning. I think it's fantastic. I can't wait for the other episodes to drop. So let's get straight into it. Why don't we begin with the career of KGB? His full name is Kabeer Gbaja. You're gonna have to help me.
The G is basically silent, so it's Kabeer Gbaja-Biamila.
There you go. I rehearsed it too this morning, but I still got it wrong. So he was, we as Bears fans here, because 95% of our audience are diehard Bears fans, we know him very well for the things that he did to our team here in Chicago. There he is. He's a mammoth man. How would you describe him as a football player?
Yeah, so he was drafted in one of the later rounds. I think it was 5th or 6th round for the Packers. So, he was drafted and there weren't super high expectations for him because he's a little bit undersized for his position. And so I think he really just had a work ethic, talking to coaches I talked to Mike Sherman in this podcast, who was the Packers coach at the time, for the majority of Kabeer's career there, which was from 2000 to, I think his last season was 2008. So, he really outperformed what the expectations for him were. And, he came out of a smaller school in California and, again, just did not have a huge name going into the NFL. And so I think it was a bit of a surprise for everybody when he ultimately passed Reggie White's Green Bay sack record, which is probably his biggest claim to fame. And he is now in the Packers Hall of Fame. So, he is an important player for that franchise. And that's a team that's had a ton of really good players go through there. So that means a lot in Green Bay. And, they now have a Packers Museum type thing. I don't remember the exact name of it, but it's like right at Lambeau Field. And you go in there and every player in their Hall of Fame has their own little football with their face on it. And it's engraved and their stories there. And so he was definitely, I think Kabeer has said this himself, like he would identify as a player who's more of that underdog type of player. Right. His parents immigrated from Nigeria to California. He grew up in Los Angeles and in not one of the best neighborhoods in LA, and ended up going to college, playing football for 4 years, getting into the NFL. And so all of that was new things for his family. And his brother Akbar also played in the NFL and is now a media personality, actually. And so, they all the kids in that family really were successful in their careers and would identify as being, underdogs, first generation Americans.
Yeah, and just to remind people of his exploits, I pulled this from Wikipedia. In his second year in the league with the Packers, he played 16 games. He had 13 and a half sacks. The following year, he had 12 sacks. The following year, he had 10 sacks. And then after that, 13 and a half. And then it dipped below double digits, but he was such a force. And if you see that 2002 season, he had that one interception for 72 yards, and that was the replay that we showed against the Chicago Bears. So we know him well as a menacing defensive end who would just pulverize our offensive linemen. You've given us background on his college and his family. So let's talk now about, well, first of all, we should say that his wife, Eileen, then wife, right? And they had, 8 kids?
Yep, they have 8 kids together.
Yeah, and I found this picture on one of her websites, and beautiful family, beautiful wife, and things seem to be going picture perfect for them. But all of a sudden, KGB, who was Muslim, had to turn to Christianity. And as you wrote in your original Sports Illustrated article, because that's where you started covering that, was when you were over at Sports Illustrated, he really was focused on religion and taking the Bible literally. And he even had an argument with players and Aaron Rodgers because he basically condemned people who were not followers of Jesus Christ. Am I saying that correctly?
Yeah, that's one of this is all covered really in episode 1, and which you just listened to. And it's sort of like Kabeer's origin story as to like how he ended up where he is today, which we'll get into as well. But he grew up culturally Muslim. They also did go to Christian church here and there too. So he was around both influences. And then his wife, Eileen, had just become a Christian, or they were dating at the time. And so that really got him more into Christianity. And then by the time he was an NFL player, he was very passionate about his Christian faith. He officially converted his rookie season, I believe it was, because there was the Packers player development coach, a man named Gil Bird, was really influential on him there and was a mentor to him in Christianity. So from there, though, Kabeer really took it, like, as you mentioned, black and white, literal, whatever was written in the Bible, he like took that to be the direct translation to how you should live your life today. So teammates of his that were divorced or getting divorced, which is obviously very common in America and society as a whole, he would make things kind of uncomfortable for them and have conversations with them about their sin and what they were doing with their lives. And so he gained a reputation as a player who was very influential on the field, but someone who none of his teammates really wanted to talk to in the locker room. And one teammate told me that people would like try to avoid him. Like it was something that you were just trying to get out of his way so that he wouldn't trap you in a Jesus conversation. And then from there, just got more and more serious, where he was getting into arguments. And there's that Aaron Rodgers anecdote, which is one of my favorite anecdotes in the story. And I haven't actually gotten a chance to ask Aaron about that moment, but this came from Kabeer. When I interviewed Kabeer, he told a story about how, one night at training camp at St. Norbert, when they would go to St. Norbert in Green Bay or De Pere, Wisconsin, he got into an argument with the Bible study group and said, well, 99% of our teammates are going to hell based on the way they're living their lives. And then Aaron, who at the time had, I guess, been going to the Bible study, per Kabeer, Aaron said, well, if this is what a Christian looks like, then I don't want any part of this. And so they got into an argument then. And I think they didn't have much of a relationship after that. And so, that's a really interesting anecdote. And so Eileen says, she had to be the good cop to Kabeer's bad cop, because at this point they're married. There are a lot of couples Bible studies, or there's a couples Bible study that Packers players for the Green Bay Packers community and team and staff and all of that. And so they'd be at these Bible studies and she'd have to really like say, oh, no, that's not what he meant. She'd really have to put out his fires, essentially.
Yeah. Okay. I don't think I did a good job of saying the name of the podcast. It is called Spiraled. The first episode was released, what was it, August 28th, 27th, 28th. Yeah. And it's phenomenal. How you start the podcast. I've always had an interest in how you start a movie, how you start a book, how you start a podcast. And I love the way you start your podcast because it's riveting audio interview with Eileen. Can you share with the audience what transpires at the beginning of your podcast?
Yeah, so the beginning scene is Eileen packing to essentially escape from her home with her children, because Kabeer, so the whole premise of this podcast is that Kabeer, along with several other former ex-NFL players, are all now part of a extreme religious group. And they left behind, the majority of them left behind their wives and multiple children to follow a charismatic leader and live life very differently from how they previously lived it. They live in kind of isolated communities where, the goal is to be what's the word I'm looking for? Like grow your own land.
Self-sufficient.
Yeah. The goal is to be self-sufficient. They really prioritize self-defense and weapons training, because they want to be prepared should the world end or should something happen where they need to defend themselves. That's a big part of their ideology. Their Hebrew Israelite is the main core. So they think that Black people are the true Israelites of the Bible, but they also welcome other races. Some Hebrew Israelite groups do not, and they're strictly only Black people are allowed to join, but this group is a little bit more inclusive. They also live by the Old Testament. So whatever laws in the Old Testament, that's kind of how they live their lives. So women are are pretty much homemakers. They have children. They sit in a different section of the church. They're not supposed to be spoken. They're not supposed to speak unless they're spoken to. And they're not even really supposed to make eye contact with the man in the community unless, they are addressed first.
About as subservient as possible, in my mind, based on what I've learned.
Yeah. They wear head coverings, and they also practice polygyny, which is men taking multiple wives. So these are all kind of facets of this religious group. Anyways, going back to Kabeer and Eileen, the opening scene is Eileen getting ready to leave her home without Kabeer knowing. And they had 7 children at the time, because she was actually pregnant with the 8th, but didn't know it yet when she left. So she's describing packing their clothes up and telling her 2 oldest sons, you need to take your watches off, because the watches had GPS tracking. So she's like, please leave your watches here. And the kids, they originally were supposed to be going on a family vacation to Washington, D.C., but Kabeer was like, no, I want us to go to Tennessee, where this religious group is headquartered. And Eileen at the time didn't know a ton about this group, started doing a little bit of research, and was really uncomfortable with what she was seeing on the pastor's YouTube page and the way he was speaking about women and about different ideas and weapons and things like that. And she just was like, I'm not comfortable with this. So Kabeer wouldn't let it go. He was like, we're going as a whole family, or I'm going to take the kids without you. And so she couldn't win this argument. And she was like, you know what? I think after speaking to her pastor and some other important people in her life, she realized she needed to just take the kids and leave for the time being until they wouldn't have to go with him to this religious group in Tennessee. So that's the opening scene, is her packing while Kabeer thinks she's packing to go to Straightway. She's really packing to take the kids away from the home while Kabeer is on a business trip.
Straightway is the name of the religion, and Pastor Dowell, I forgot his first name. Jim Dowell, is it? Charles Dowell. I found some video from the website Straightway, and this is Pastor Dowell preaching to his congregation. And then when the camera widens out, there's one of the, I'm assuming would call him an usher. He has what appears to be an AR-15 or automatic weapon. What's going on here? This is not my version of church.
Yeah, that is what they do. I mean, Pastor Dowell, anywhere he goes, he pretty much has at least one, usually multiple men like that, who are either usually they're dressed in all black. Sometimes they're dressed in white if it's like if it's a feast day or a holy day of some sort. Usually dressed in all black, and they are armed. And, that's just part of what they practice. And I think part of it too, like Charles Dowell was in the Army for 10 years. He has a military background, and he's very macho. He's hyper masculine. And I think that is part of what has attracted Kabeer. Actually, I mean, I know this firsthand because I've asked Kabeer, and I've asked Robert Mathis, former Colts player who is also involved in this group. I've asked both of them, what attracted you to Charles Dowell? Like, what is so appealing to you about him? And one thing that they both say is he's a man's man. He's not afraid to tell it like it is. And that aspect of him, the guns, the macho, even the way he talks and the way he stands, he very much uses a power stance. He's a very deep voice, and he kind of sounds like he's yelling a lot of the time. That is really appealing to these guys. And I think, armchair psychologists, probably because they were looking for a football-like culture when they retired from football. And Kabeer has even said multiple times to me and on his YouTube channel that he felt like Christianity was too soft and it was feminine. And so that, I think, is exactly why he was interested in somebody like Charles Dowell. And that is just part of his brand, part of his image, is having someone with a large gun nearby. And when he does his YouTube videos, he actually has those guns like behind him on the wall. So it's just something he wants to be seen with at all times.
Yeah, he's still very active. He posted a video, I think, about 24 hours ago. So tell me where this story heads to past episode 1, which again, I highly encourage this audience to listen to this podcast. I think you'll be riveted by it, not just because this is a former NFL player, but there's so many dynamics in this story, and I can't wait. It's like, watching The Last Dance or something on HBO. I can't wait to next week's episode. That's how I am right now. Tell me where the story is headed.
Yeah, the story is headed. So we start with Kabeer, and he's kind of the focal point to get entryway into this story. And then in the next episode, we're going to introduce a couple other ex-NFL players who are part of the religious group, or part of Straightway as well. Daniel Muir, who played for the Packers and the Colts, and I believe the Raiders also. He's not really a big name, but he played for about 6 years, I believe, kind of a journeyman defensive tackle. And then Robert Mathis, who obviously is very famous of the Colts, could be a Hall of Famer someday. He's been, in their selection process, hasn't made it to be a finalist yet, but could be in the cards for him someday. So he is also part of this group. So we start telling a little bit of their story. And then we also are going to introduce characters, people who are not former football players, but who have been a part of this group, who either grew up in it as a child or joined it as an adult. And they're going to share their experiences about how the experience of being part of Straightway and enduring verbal abuse, sometimes physical abuse, with the example of the man who we interviewed who grew up there as a child. They regularly beat children as a form of discipline. And so he experienced that as a child, and he experienced a lot of verbal abuse as well. He was gay growing up in the community, which was a really tough experience because they obviously don't believe that anyone should be gay. They believe that's a sin, and are frequently talking about that. And so those people are going to share their experiences. And then you're also going to hear the stories of of one young woman who was introduced to Straightway as a minor and was in contact with women who live at Straightway, again, as a minor, and then left her home exactly when she turned 18 to go live there. And her parents have not heard from her since. So you're going to hear that story. And then you're going to hear from the wife, now ex-wife, of the fourth former ex-NFL player that we know. Her name's Christiana Clemmings, or her name is now Christiana Cook. She was married to TJ Clemmings, who actually did also play for the Bears for a brief stint. He's an offensive lineman. I'm not sure if he ever actually appeared in a game for the Bears. That would be interesting to look up. He was also journeyman offensive lineman. He actually had huge expectations for the Minnesota Vikings to be a left tackle for them, and never panned out. Had injuries, just was not, needed development that he just didn't get because he was injured. And so we're going to hear from his ex-wife, and she shares an eerily similar story to Eileen, almost exactly the same pattern of how she had to flee with her children as well, and how she doesn't recognize her ex-husband anymore. And she was pregnant with triplets when TJ left to join Straightway, which is just a crazy thing to say out loud. Is, your wife is pregnant with triplets and you decided to follow Pastor Dowell and not be there for her anymore because this charismatic leader was so appealing to you. So you're going to hear from her. And at the very end, I'm not going to spoil the ending, but it was national news in July. Daniel Muir, the former Colts player, he did make national news because he was actually arrested. And it's a very long, detailed explanation as to why he was arrested. But what you need to know is that a SWAT team raided the community that he actually started with Robert Mathis of Straightway in rural Indiana. Oh, wow. And so that was fascinating to me. And I feel like that actually might even just lead more to happen in the story, because up until that point, there had never been law enforcement that had a reason to enter one of these communities. And Kabeer actually leads the Green Bay community of Straightway. So it's like different sort of franchises of the same group that are all over the country, and two of which are led by these ex-NFL players. So yeah, and we talk about topics like, the search for identity after retirement, why we introduce Pastor Dowell's background. And then we go into the very controversial history of straightway because they came out of another religious group that was very popular on shortwave radio. They were called the Overcomer Ministry, led by a man named R.G. Stair. And R.G. Stair actually died in prison because he ended up in prison through actually multiple times in his life. He was accused of inappropriate behavior towards women in the community and some of the minors. So he eventually ended up in prison and died in prison. But that is the group that Straightway is inextricably tied to and came out of. So we go into that a little bit too. And I think, it's just a twisting, fascinating story with a lot of themes that are really relatable, even outside of sports.
Yeah, indeed. Now, did you reach out to Pastor Dowell? I know that you talked to KGB like 4 years ago when you were working on your initial piece, and you had like a 6-hour Zoom call with him. So you asked him a lot of deep questions, and this has helped with your reporting on this new version of the story. What about Pastor Dowell? Did you reach out to interview him?
Yeah, we tried multiple times. For the original story, I obviously tried to interview him. He's the type of person that, like, an intermediary is always doing the conversation with him. Like, you can't get to him directly. So at that time in 2020, Kabeer was middlemaning that interaction for me, actually. And so, and then we tried other ways too. Like, there's a few phone numbers listed for him. There's a phone number for Straightway, obviously, because they want to have conversations with people about their faith and what they believe. So they have a number that actually the women answer all hours of the day. And so I've called there and been hung up on multiple times once I say who I am. And then for the podcast, we went back and forth with an elder in the community who was sort of the intermediary for Dowell. And at first it seemed like they might be interested. And then they realized who we were and that it was me, and it was connected with the Sports Illustrated article that I did 4 years ago, and they said no. So I have not gotten a chance to actually interview Pastor Dowell. Although on YouTube, 4 years ago, he did put out a video. I think it was right before the Sports Illustrated story came out. He knew we were working on it, obviously. And he put out a video that was essentially like challenging me to a live debate. And I was like, all right, as a journalist, it's not really the job that I'm here to do. It's, I'm not here to debate you on and tell you what you believe is right or wrong, or like argue a point with you. I just want to ask you questions based off of things that other people have said about you or about your group or things that have happened to them there, and then have you respond to them. But it didn't seem like that was what he was going to agree to. So his, that wasn't something we even considered, because it was just not really within the realm of like how an interview would go.
Yeah.
Or should go. Yeah.
Well, I got to tell you, I am appreciative of your journalistic skills. Throughout this interview and everything that I've read that you've written and on the podcast, you don't make any value judgments about anyone. You're just reporting what you've seen, what you've heard, and sharing straight news. And so applause for that. And so I want to talk a little bit about your career, and then I got a question or two about the Bears. So if I can keep you another 5 minutes or so. Yeah. You worked at Sports Illustrated. You went to Northwestern University. You're from Wisconsin. You worked at Sports Illustrated. You worked at The Athletic. Now you're at ESPN. Is that a good summary of your career?
Yeah, that is. I started working for Peter King at Sports Illustrated, and he was an awesome mentor. Yeah, still talk to him all the time, even though he's technically retired, although he just announced he's doing a podcast with Bill Belichick and Jim Gray. Or not, is Jim Gray on it? I think so. Yeah.
I think so.
Jim, Bill Belichick. There's somebody else. Max Crosby, I think.
Wow.
Yeah, so that's cool. So he's not fully retired, which I knew he wouldn't be able to sit still for that long. But he's great. That was an awesome entryway into this field. So learned a lot from him. Yeah. And then also worked at Defector, which is, I'll plug Defector any chance I get. It's a startup. It is the people who made Deadspin great several years ago started their own website called Defector, and it's very similar to the old Deadspin, but they are super smart, super creative, and like really good, really informed, writing and opinions and commentary there. And so they do sports, culture, you name it. So I worked there for a couple of years before I went to The Athletic.
Well, you moved around quite a bit, and that's a tribute, I think, to your quality of your work. Congratulations. By the way, we had Peter King on about 2 weeks after he announced that he was retiring.
Nice.
And just in listening to him when we were asking him questions about what's he going to do, and he talked about drinking coffee, not worried about the deadline of getting the column out on Monday and so forth. But you can still tell he's going to do something. There's just no way. Right. So he's a necessary voice in our sports culture. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the Chicago Bears. What is your feeling about Ryan Poles and how he has built this team? The first 2 years of his tenure, very, very difficult to sit through these games. Casual fans, many just said, I'm going to do something better on Sundays. And us diehard fans have been crying and yelling and screaming. But now it appears that perhaps his efforts to rebuild this team are actually going to bear fruit. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. I think I agree with the take that I've seen everywhere, which is, Caleb Williams is probably in the best situation that a rookie quarterback could be in, or maybe ever has been in, for a rookie quarterback who is starting as a rookie. I think they've done, aside from offensive line depth, which I think is still a question, I think they've done, but honestly, that I don't know a team in the league really that you wouldn't worry about offensive line depth. I mean, offensive line play it's just a problem across the NFL. Yes. And there's not enough offensive linemen who can do the job well and consistently and then stay healthy. So I think that would be my one concern with this roster is just the depth on the offensive line for Caleb. But otherwise, he's got the playmakers that Justin Fields did not have. He's got the defense that Justin Fields did not have. So, I'm not going to say it's definitely going to work this year, because I do think it's going to depend on how quickly Caleb can assimilate and show us that he can operate within structure against a number one NFL defense. Because I think that's the thing that we probably didn't see in the preseason is against a starting defense, the consistency of operating the offense within the structure. We saw him go out of structure multiple times, and that was really exciting. And that's obviously a necessary skill that your quarterback needs to have. And it really seemed very Patrick Mahomes-ian of him on several of those plays, outside the pocket, breaking out on a run, throwing off balance. Like, that was all so impressive. But I think it will just depend on how quickly he can operate within the structure of the offense against the starting defense. But I think the roster I think it's in a really good place.
Yeah. I know some of us complain about, we don't have depth here, or we need another pass rusher and so forth. And I keep going back to when you're rebuilding a team from scratch, it doesn't happen overnight, or it doesn't happen in a season or two. It's a continuous process. Like you said, and other people have said, no team in the NFL has depth at every position. It's just a constant challenge for general managers. Finally, I just can't thank you enough for taking a half hour of your time to talk about Spiraled, the exciting new podcast. And I urge everyone to follow your work over at ESPN. Is there anything you want to plug that's coming up?
I have a story coming next week. Just finishing it up this week about a couple quarterback trends. But really the point is, like, more quarterbacks are starting games than ever before in NFL history. The last 3 seasons have been more than you would even anticipate by just adding a 17th game. It's like outperforming what you would think the number would be, which should be somewhere in the 50s. And it's about a 66 average of number of starting quarterbacks per season, because you just keep seeing starters go down. Wow. Backups get hurt. You're on to your third quarterback. There were 2 teams last year. Actually, there were 3 teams last year that played 4 or more quarterbacks, started 4 or more quarterbacks. So it's something that, NFL front offices are taking very seriously, and it's going to have an impact on how quarterback rooms are structured. And then, because of that, it's like there's more quarterback starting games than ever before, but there's also like fewer quarterbacks available to play. There's less qualified backups. So I kind of go into why that is and what that means. And so that will be coming out next week, and probably perfect timing ahead of the first quarterback getting hurt. Although actually the first quarterback already got hurt in JJ McCarthy.
That's right.
Yeah. So that's coming next week. So look out for that.
We'll definitely be looking out for that. Will you be also writing in that story about the NFLPA vetoing the third quarterback? Because why would they do that? I've had a lot of people ask me. I don't know why.
I think it was confusing the way it was reported because they didn't get rid of the whole thing. So last year, the owners passed a provision that would allow for the third quarterback. If you already have him on your 53-man roster, it couldn't be a practice squad elevation. It had to be someone who's on your active 53-man roster. You could dress that third quarterback and he wouldn't count to your 48 game day actives. That was what went into play last year. That is still true for this year. So you can still do that this year. But what the NFLPA vetoed was an update to that rule, which would have allowed teams to take that third quarterback as a practice squad elevation for an unlimited number of times throughout the season. Yeah. So right now, the limit is 3 elevations per player. So if I have my third string quarterback on my practice squad, I can only have him active and available for a game 3 times in the season, unless I sign him to my active roster, and then I can have him for every single game, and he's not going to count towards my 48. So that's what the PA vetoed. And the reason is because they felt like that would be creating a whole different class of player. And it would essentially be like legal stashing, because if you want to use that 53rd spot for, an extra offensive lineman or an extra receiver or something, like you're obviously going to do that every week, and you're not going to ever put your practice squad third on your active roster during the week, which means they're not making the money that they could be making otherwise. And it's just limiting their opportunities and it is creating a separate class of a player, because there's no other position. There'd be no other position that you could unlimited call up on game day. Like it's only a quarterback. So, so the NFLPA said no to that update specifically.
All right. Well, I appreciate the context there, because it makes it a little bit more understandable as to why the NFLPA vetoed that. Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Kalyn, again, many, many thanks. We'll be following your work